This is Steve Bookchester at WBAI. With me today is Ralph Schoenman, Personal Secretary to Lord Russell, Secretary of the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation. Mr. Schoenman has recently come back to the United States, not particularly of his own desire. He was at the Regis Debray trial in Bolivia, and I guess we ought to just let you explain what happened there.
Yes, well, together with some colleagues, I had gone to Bolivia in July for the purpose of at once observing the trial of Regis Debray and also for the purpose of presenting evidence, as several of our commission had been in close touch with Regis Debray shortly prior to his visit to Bolivia. And although my colleagues had left somewhat earlier, I remained in Bolivia with the exception of 3 weeks when I had returned to London until a few days ago. And during that time I was in the process of preparing a report which concerns the trial of Debray and concerns the situation of the guerrilla struggle in Bolivia and the behavior of the armed forces, in particular with regard to captured prisoners and material witnesses relevant to the defense of Debray. Consequently, the material that had been gathered was worked up into a full legal document which was acceptable in a legal sense to the military tribunal. Some of this evidence had to do with the murder of Bolivians who could have testified in defense of Regis. Some of it had to do with the treatment which was received by Regis himself, and other of the report had to do with the elimination of such guerrillas as Jorge Vasquez, who was the scion of a very eminent literary and historical family in Bolivia. Vasquez, for example, who had been wounded, was tortured under the direct instruction of President Barrientos. The officer who tortured and killed him is named Major Yves Alacon. His 4 limbs were broken before he was killed. And Jorge Vasquez knew and could have testified to the fact that Regis Debray had not gone to Bolivia as a man of action intending to incorporate himself in the guerrillas, but had gone in order to make contact with Che Guevara and to write about the perspective of Che for the Latin American Revolution and the prospects of the Bolivian guerrillas. This material I presented to the court a few days ago by appealing to the president of the court for the liberty to submit it as evidence. And as a result of that, I was arrested in the court and expelled from it, and then detained in the town of Camiri with some of the captured guerrillas, in particular El Camba and El Leon, Choqui Choqui, Rocabero, Pasto Barrera. 3 of these men are in fact defendants in the present trial. Then, after I think some discussion on the part of the military, who were a little bit uncertain how to play this because they, I think, realized that the report was something difficult for them to handle, and the arrest took place in the presence of a number of journalists from world agencies, so it was a little difficult to handle this particular case as they have handled others, which is with gun law. Nonetheless, I was taken to La Paz under armed guard, and then they took me to the Ministry of Government, which is the headquarters of their intelligence, civilian intelligence service, I suppose something equivalent to the FBI. where they tried to interrogate me, not very successfully. And then they took me to the army headquarters, the Estado Mayor. And there I was put in something that really, I suppose, is better described as a cage rather than a cell, because it was something in the order of 2.5 feet by 5 feet. And I was locked up in that, and the problem really was that in La Paz the altitude is approximately 15,000 feet, and while one can become acclimatized to that, in a very small and confined place with a limit to the oxygen, breathing becomes a real torment. And this was the most immediate problem for me at the time. I was extremely fortunate in the attitude taken up by the soldiers themselves, the conscripts, most of whom are impoverished peasants and workers' sons, who took every opportunity they could to open the door of this cell and to get me things to read and to talk. They were teaching me Quechua, Aymara, and Guarani. And in fact, one of the soldiers was instrumental in persuading an officer to let me out for a walk. And then I was told by an intelligence officer by the name of Jaime Cespedes, who I think had been observing my activity for some time, that without any doubt those who came to the Estado Mayor did not leave it. And he seemed pleased to be able to say that it was certainly a probability that I would be shot. This was confirmed by the head of the Sección Segunda, the intelligence service of the army, who said that I would be shot. And considering that I was held incommunicado and I was unable to contact a lawyer or any of my friends in La Paz, I decided that the only reasonable thing for me to do was to try to get away. So I persuaded some soldiers to let me out for air, and walked as near as I could to the exterior wall, and then made a run for it and scaled it. And I was able to get over the other side. They shot at me twice. But unfortunately, I turned my ankle in jumping over the wall, and I was unable to get very far. I got about a quarter of a mile into a ravine when I was surrounded by soldiers with automatic weapons. In particular, an officer named Lieutenant Quiroga, who told the soldiers that I should be shot like a pig with my face in the dirt. That's not very original. That's a slogan that you find on leaflets in the guerrilla zones handed out to the soldiers. It's the treatment that they accord suspected guerrillas. But I was lucky in that there was another officer there, a major named Hugo Porcel, who stopped that and saw that I was returned to the cell, where they kept me for about 27 hours before they let me out again. And then I was taken to the government ministry, where they tried to interrogate me again, not very successfully. So I told them that the first thing they had to do was to decide if they were preferring charges, and if they were, to allow me contact with a lawyer. If they were choosing not to do that, then they'd better reserve their questions until they were ready to do so. At this point, they took everything I had, which included my passport and my air passage and such money as I had with me. And they told me that I was going to be expelled, which for me was comparatively welcome news. And then, a few hours after that, they took me into a room where there were some Bolivian officials. In came an American at this point, who turned out to be the U.S. Consul Donald C. Lotz. Lotz handed me a letter from the U.S. State Department to the effect that my passport was to be taken from me, and he told me that he would be confiscating my passport and that I would be expelled to the United States. I told him that the passport was my property and that he had no right to act arbitrarily in taking it. This was something which could only be done through a procedure with a tribunal of some form, administrative or whatever, with the right of appeal, and that his function really, nominally at least, is to protect U.S. citizens not to conspire in their kidnapping or extradition. Obviously, the authority of the Bolivian government ends at its frontier, and they had no more right to expel me further than their frontier than they had in the cases of Maspero or Feltrinelli, neither of whom were sent to France or Italy, respectively, both of whom were sent to Lima, their point of entry into Bolivia. And I told the man that, for my part, I had no intention of returning to the United States at this point, as my work is in London, my residence is in London, my wife, and I've lived there now 9 years, although I certainly hoped to be coming to the United States in the course of trips. This was something for me to decide and not to be determined for me. He was, I think the only way to put it is, pleased with his situation. He felt he had me, and made that pretty plain. I told him that the satisfaction would be short-lived because recourse was always available, and that they really had to make up their minds whether they were to prevent my being able to speak about the experience or whether they were prepared to answer for their acts. And I then spoke to the Bolivians in Spanish and told them that I had no intention of coming to the United States and did not recognize their right to send me there, and accused them of having stolen my property, my passport and my air ticket. Told them that I would certainly make that known along with all their other acts against other people. That was a small satisfaction, I suppose, and it didn't really come to very much because I was kept under armed guard and the next day taken to the airport in the company of intelligence officers and armed police, and at the airport I was handed a letter of identity, an air ticket, and they made an effort to bundle me on the plane. I became angry and tore up the letter of identity, and they told me that the only alternative to my going on the plane was to return to detention in the Estado Mayor. And I began to get the impression that the prospect of return was not a very good one for me, because these things are done on whim, and I calculated, I suppose, that I might have a better chance to at once make known what was going on, and as well fight for my own right if I did come back to the United States and take up the matter of my passport with my lawyer, Leonard Boudin. So at the last moment I got on the plane, and in Lima I was under police guard. I managed to get a cable out through a Chilean journalist who I'd known previously, happened to be in the airport, alerting Leonard Boudin as to the situation, and then I was sent on to Miami. In Miami I was simply given another letter informing me I could not leave this country, and then I came on to Philadelphia and New York, which brings us up to date.
Just to clarify one thing for our listeners who might not know the full history of this or been following it, I take it your passport, they say your passport was canceled because of a trip you had made to Hanoi earlier.
Yes, but they have not done this in any procedural way. There hasn't been a hearing or a legal action which would enable them to take this with due process. That particular matter of area restriction is being tested at this moment in the courts by Leonard Boudin, and it hardly is an excuse for an arbitrary action on the part of a consular officer. There still has to be some procedure in which I can contest it and have the right of appeal of such a decision.
Had they ever tried to reclaim your passport before this?
On previous occasions my passport had been reclaimed and then won back when I visited Hanoi on past occasions, and also when I had gone to China many years ago, 1962-63. Yes, but I had subsequently got passports through the courts. So I don't think that's really a sufficient excuse. Yes, if they had followed some administrative procedure, if we want to deal with the formality of the matter. But what this really amounted to was collusion on the part of the U.S. authorities, mainly I think their intelligence service and their Bolivian counterparts, to bundle me off to the United States. And in that I have very, very little to complain of in comparison with those who have been in this struggle in the field in Latin America and who have paid a much more dear price than being sent back to their native country. For example, Regis himself, who was tortured barbarously, was in coma for something like 4 days, required 5 blood transfusions, had his nails broken at the time.
How do you know this? None of this to my recollection, and the only reason I'm asking, none of this to my recollection has appeared in the American press.
Yes, well, I don't think that should surprise you. I know it in several ways. I know it from Regis Debray himself. I know it from military officers who were present, with whom I've spoken, from some of whom I have obtained material, documentary and photographic material, which we will publish when I have a chance to talk to my colleagues in London and we can put together a full report. But you know that the experience of Regis Debray in all senses violates the law of Bolivia, the Constitution of Bolivia. The man was held incommunicado. He was, as I mentioned, tortured and beaten. He was not allowed to consult lawyers. He was not presented before a civil judge for 2 months. He was arbitrarily put under the jurisdiction of a council of war, consisting of military officers, many of whom in fact are involved in the anti-guerrilla operations. He is not allowed a defense lawyer except that appointed by the military tribunal, a military man who is at best timid in the defense of Debray. That they handed Regis Debray, whose name is Raul Novillo, a man I know very well because we shared the same room in Camiri. And I would have to say this, that Novillo is an honest man, but extremely limited and infinitely frightened. Wouldn't begin to challenge the jurisdiction of this tribunal in the way that could be done. You consider that the Bolivian Constitution, which is a model document, prohibits torture and prohibits any violation of habeas corpus, and not only does that, but says that if there are such violations, the victim cannot be tried for any offense, and those who attempt to try him or prosecute him in the light of the violation of his rights become themselves liable to imprisonment, loss of all official position. And there isn't any doubt that this tribunal is composed of a group of criminals under the law, fundamental law of the country, the Constitution, all of whom should be deprived of their positions and locked up. And these things I said in Camiri and presented in the report. When you go beyond that and learn that the witnesses who were in a position to defend Debray were killed or who received other arbitrary treatment, imprisoned, tortured, intimidated, disappeared, with the connivance and knowledge of the military and the tribunal itself, it's fairly evident that the whole thing is a farce. But even taken on its own merit, taken on its own pretension, the accusation against Régis Debray is that he is guilty of assassination and robbery. Now, there hasn't been a single witness for the prosecution who has been able to state this. And the reason is very simple. Debray did not go to Bolivia in order to incorporate himself in the guerrillas. If he had, he would still be there, or he would be dead. Debray did not participate in any armed encounter. Debray did not rob anybody, and there isn't anyone in a position to state that he did, including the 3 officers of the Bolivian army captured by the guerrilla in Yancahuasu, the scene of the first armed choque that took place last April. Those 3 men all made it very clear that Debray was not in the guerrilla, was not participating in the armed struggle, and was not involved in any such acts as could be described as assassination or robbery. So the fundamental thing is that quite apart from the illegitimacy of the tribunal itself, Régis is innocent. Now, Debray, this must be made very clear, Debray is a revolutionary by conviction and by profession. That is to say, he has never attempted to conceal his revolutionary feeling and action. But neither his desires or his intentions or his convictions are relevant. Of course, for any revolutionary, the struggle is served whether one carries arms at a given moment or whether the revolution is served in other ways. And the ideas of the revolution are vital to it. But a man is only guilty for the acts he commits. And I suppose this is the point at which we really ought to take this whole discussion out of the realm of formalism, because for me at least, the fundamental issue is not the question of whether Régis pulled a trigger or wrote a book. The fundamental issue is what one does about a country such as Bolivia, in which the greater part of the population are totally outside the life of the society. Something like 80% of the Bolivian nation consists of Indians who are without the remotest semblance of rights. Doctors unknown, medicine unknown, education unknown, life expectancy minimal. 1 out of 3 die before the age of 1. The mines, the central column of the Bolivian economy, a very nightmarish scene. All the miners have silicosis. All of them live in appalling poverty. All of them are highly politicized, very militant, and subject to continuous, massacre is the only word. Mines are occupied by the army. These conditions obtained in the cities. Bolivia is a country under a very brutal occupation, occupied by its own army in the service of the United States, in the service of U.S. imperialism. So the question at issue in the trial of Régis Debray is not the formalism of such acts as he may have committed. What's at issue is the emancipation, liberation of the people of Bolivia and of Latin America. And in the service of that objective, there's no doubt that Régis Debray went to Bolivia. And in the service of that objective, Che Guevara was attempting a continental strategy of liberation. And in support of those objectives, the Russell Foundation was hoping to make more clear to people outside Latin America the need to solidarize with the struggle.
Yeah, I meant to get to that many people think the only thing the Russell Foundation does is to be involved in the War Crimes Tribunal, uh, and very few people were aware that it has activities in other areas. And if you could, sort of in the trend of this discussion, can carry on that for a moment.
Fine. Well, the War Crimes Tribunal for us was a militant form of action which was, again, in the context of solidarity with a revolutionary struggle. I suppose I better speak personally here, not for this tribunal. I'm not interested in the formalism, if you like, of whether the United States has violated certain laws or not. I'm interested in the fact that an enormous power is attempting to butcher and destroy heroic people who are seeking their liberation. Liberation not only within their national frontiers, but liberation of those subject to that world system we call imperialism, which I don't think is a piece of political polemic, but a very precise and sociological term. So the Foundation's interest, if you like, in the tribunal extends to the point that the tribunal can service the anti-imperialist struggle. And to the extent that the tribunal does that, to that extent it has our enthusiasm and our energy and our resources. So we look on the tribunal as part of a program of action, and it pertains to Africa, and it pertains to Latin America, and it pertains to other parts of Asia. We've been sending people and traveling. I've been traveling in these different parts of the world, and wherever we do travel, we try to make contact with the struggle, the revolutionary struggle of the area concerned, and to do what we can to engage in it ourselves, to line up, to struggle with those people. So certainly the Foundation is involved in these things, whether in Tanzania or Congo or Bolivia, other places. I hope to be continuing in that.
Does Lord Russell share these positions that you just expressed? You said you were just speaking for yourself as an individual.
Well, I said that because I'm called the Secretary General of the International War Crimes Tribunal, which is a Catholic body with a small c, and I therefore like to protect myself against the danger of offending any one member of it. As to Russell, Bertrand Russell has made his own views known so many times in so many ways. He sees the press, he's on television, he's got this stream of visitors who have access to him. No one is denied access to Bertrand Russell who has something serious to discuss with him. And I think it's by now known that I travel 70-80% of my time, you know, so it really, I hope, is time for the devil theory to be buried and for Bertrand Russell to be allowed anti-imperialist opinions. After all, he's held these anti-imperialist views since the Boer War, and he's articulated them in the case of Leopold's butchery in the Congo, and he was president of the India League in the 30s, and you know, the man has a monumental record of anti-imperialist struggle, and I don't think that it's really necessary to attribute my opinions to him. He has his own. The real dynamic of the process is the other way round, as I suppose most people would guess. Russell has influenced 4 or 5 generations, including my own.
I was wondering if you should, just to conclude, speak briefly. I noticed that the second session of the War Crimes Tribunal is going to take place very shortly. And if you could discuss what you think will happen at that.
The second session is planned for Copenhagen, 20th of this month. And I think the highlight of that session will be the evidence that emerges from the presence of one of our investigating teams in the liberated zones of South Vietnam. where they spent a long period of time, and out of that investigation will emerge something of the record of the use of experimental weapons on the part of the United States, testing ground. As you know, they use Vietnam as a testing ground for counterinsurgency warfare in many places, such as Bolivia. And the biological weapons, biochemical weapons, the napalm, the magnesium bombs, the white phosphorus, the nerve gas that have been tested out in Vietnam have been witnessed and investigated by these teams, and that will be reported on. There will be witnesses from the victims as well. Who knows but that there may be some Americans who were there as combatants who can give some evidence.
I guess one last question. Now that you're in New York, at least for a brief period, do you have any special plans during your visit here?
Well, I suppose my most immediate thought is the thought of restoring my mobility. But I have a large number of friends here and people I'm anxious to see, things to do in the political sense, many things that the foundation wants to do, and for us, not just because I'm an American, but for obvious reasons, the heart of the anti-imperialist struggle is here. So I hope to be active in things to do with that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schoenman. This is Steve Bookchester for WBAI.